Hello and welcome to Piwik Pro YouTube video series. Topic of the video: overview of triggers in Piwik Pro Tag Manager. So what we're gonna learn? First we'll learn what is a trigger, how to add and attach triggers to your tags, and first, before we get to any specific trigger types, we're gonna talk about general information that you should know about trigger conditions and logic that can be applied to them. Then we're gonna zoom in to explain each trigger type with some live examples. Let's dive in. So, what is a trigger? A trigger is a condition-based mechanism that listens to events, such as, for example, users clicks on your website. And then, when those events take place and trigger conditions are met, it will fire the associated tag or tags. In that sense, triggers will initiate the script in the user's browsers under a given condition. And in the context of analytics data tracking, we basically specify what needs to happen on our website so that we can send data via tags script. That's about it when it comes to explaining what's a trigger. Important is that knowing how to use triggers is crucial for effective tags setup and effective tracking setup. Now, how different building blocks, tags, triggers, and variables are interacting with each other in a broader sense was described in another video, Introduction to Piwik Pro Tag Manager. I'll drop the link in the description below. Let's get to the product. What I want to show you how to add and attach triggers to a tag. So first way of adding a trigger is by adding a trigger via tag setup. So once you set up a tag, and this is just an example, so it will work the same way with each and every tag template. But once you have a tag, you can scroll down to the very bottom, and in here you have a section tag triggers. At the moment, there's no trigger attached to this particular tag, so we need to add a trigger. And there are two ways. One, by adding a new trigger while setting up a tag, and that's the one that I'm going to show you now. So click Add Trigger, choose a trigger type. We'll get to trigger types in just a moment, but for now I'm just going to choose Page Trigger, and I'm not going to set up any conditions just yet. So I'm going to name it Test, and I'm going to add it. And you can see that the trigger that I've created was attached to that very tag. So we do have a trigger that is already attached to this tag, tag 1. I can click here and I can edit that trigger or detach it from the view of this particular tag. And once I save it, they'll be basically paired together, meaning tag and a trigger. So let's save it. But now another way of adding a trigger would be by going to Triggers and then hit Add a Trigger. This time I'm going to call it Test2 and I'm going to add it. But this trigger is not being attached to any tag. I would need to go to a tag, so I'm going to choose this time Tag 2. And rather than hitting Add a Trigger, I'm going to click on Choose Existing Trigger. And you can see that Test2 has been just created. So I'm going to click Test2 and I'm going to hit OK. And now once I save it, I have trigger that was attached to a tag. Now, important information is that you can attach multiple triggers to a tag. Let me explain why would you want to do that. It's because while setting conditions for individual trigger types, so let me edit this trigger, you can add few conditions joined by AND condition. So let me give you an example, ABC, and say XYZ. Now in this case, for this particular trigger to fire a tag, both of those conditions, page URL contains ABC and page URL contains XYZ. So those two saved values would have to be contained in the URL, somewhere in the URL. So let's say ABC would be here and then XYZ somewhere here. If that's the case, then that trigger would fire our tag, tag 1. However, let's save it. I could add multiple triggers to a given tag, and then we're using here OR condition, which means that tag will fire if at least one of trigger conditions are met. And bear in mind that tag can fire multiple times during a website visit. And what it basically means is that a visitor might come to our website, and when these trigger conditions are met, tag will fire, and then later those conditions of this particular trigger might be met, and then tag would fire. Or perhaps conditions for this particular tag, click trigger example 1, trigger conditions are met, and then tag would fire. Notice that we have different trigger types. This one is a page view, this one is a page view, and this one is a click trigger type. So there might be different trigger types attached to a one and the same tag. In our case, that's tag 1. Except for a page view trigger type, the rest of trigger types has a specific set of conditions that are available only for a given type of trigger. So if I take an example of a click trigger, if I check here, I can see that I have a click related conditions. If I go to triggers that are, let's say, form submission, I will have conditions that are related to form. So form ID, form URL, form class, form name. So this is what I mean by specific set of conditions for a specific type of trigger. Now, there are certain conditions that are common for all triggers, like page URL, page path, page hostname, things like that. On top of that, let's keep editing. On top of that, we have those conditions are basically built-in variables. So those are the variables are mechanisms in which tag captures values from the browser environment. So form ID, form URL, or page URL, page path, and there are built-in variables, but there are also custom variables. Here I have an example of a custom variable, and you can use both of them. Custom variable, however, first need to be added. So we need to basically create that mechanism for capturing values. And here is just a JavaScript, but it's nothing in it, it's just a test. So we could use all different variables, which then could be used as triggers. There'll be another video for variables, but what I want to mention is that once you create a variable, it can become a powerful condition for our triggers. Lastly, there's another option or section of a trigger where you can see the status of your trigger, meaning right under the title of your trigger. So I'm under triggers and I'm under a specific trigger. In here, right under the title, you can see the status of it. So what type of trigger that is, click, you can see it here as well. And then how many tags this trigger is being used with. So in our case, that's 0. And then whether it is published trigger or not. Now I can switch to another one. This one is unpublished, used by 0 tags. And then if I go to this one is a page view trigger, so it's a different type of trigger, and it is being used by 1 tag, and it is also published. So that's another thing that you might want to know when using triggers. Now let's get to the part where I explain different trigger types. So now we know in order to add a trigger, you need to click on add a trigger. And here we see all different trigger types. Now we remember from the very beginning of this video is that trigger is a condition-based mechanism that listens to events. Now, how can I check what events are being listened to? You can go to Tag Manager and then click on debug mode, which will open our website with this sidebar. And that's a debug mode. What it allows us to do is we can take a look at our tags, which were fired, etc. But what I want you to focus right now on is the event log, because those are the events that we were talking about when we were talking about the triggers. And if we take a look at all these different types of triggers, they all respond to different sort of events. So page view, if I were to refresh the page, in the page reloaded page, we can see a page view, DOM ready, and page load. Those are the 3 events that are being linked to the page view event. If I were to click on the button, let's say this one, there should be a click, 2 clicks actually. Number 17 and 19, those are both click events. If I were to, let's say, wait long enough, there will be a time trigger. So here we have a time trigger that shows up in certain intervals. We see first interval, second interval, and if we wait long enough, there will be another trigger, time trigger. There you go. And if I were to, let's say, move my cursor away from the website area, we can see leave content. I can do it a few times and I can see that it was recorded a few times, which is linked to the page leave trigger. If I were to scroll, I can see scroll events. And again, those are linked to the page scroll trigger. We're going to use those later to check for some values that we can use in our conditions for each individual tag to then be used, and we can take advantage of them using variables and so on. So that's why I wanted to explain that first. But now let's get to the PageView trigger. So I'm going to click on add a trigger, and I've got PageView trigger type selected already. Let's add a name. And in here, I have load this tag right after the browser. And then here I've got 3 stages. When I look at the page, so I can refresh the page and the page shows on the screen almost immediately. But there are stages to those, to the page load. And the PageView stage means that the initial stage where the browser begins to fetch the page content. Then there's a DOM ready. So this state is triggered when the document object model, DOM is fully loaded and parsed, but before external resources like images and style sheets are fully loaded. And then finally, the page load. This state is triggered when the entire page, including all dependent resources like images and style sheets, has fully loaded. It means basically that the page is completely rendered and ready for interaction. Now, in most cases, you would use the first one, and in most cases, this don't matter. But there are pages where the page might be loading quite long. And in this case, if we track, let's say, custom dimension on our blog, this element, the finances, might not be ready to be captured. If we want to prevent that, if we want to be sure that the element is ready to be captured with our custom dimension, well, we would probably want to wait for HTML or page load until we capture that element. Now, how do we want to, if we were to check that, we can always go to event log and let's say refresh the page and see whether, so that was the PageView, and we can see the PageView was first, then there was a DOM ready, then page load, and we can see whether the variable blog post category, we can see that it is ready, finances. So it's ready on the PageView. So if I'm sure that it is being rendered on a PageView stage, then that's fine. And that's it when it comes to this settings. Now, events conditions. So first here we have option on all pages. Event condition is fire a tag on all pages. So if this trigger is using this option, any tag that this trigger would be attached to would fire that tag on all pages, on each and every page load. So that's the all pages, but in many cases you would want to use some sort of conditions. And for PageView sort of trigger, quite likely we would use page URL, page path, page hostname built-in variable to set the conditions. Let's say I want to fire a tag on a blog post. I don't want to fire it on this page, so let's copy that, but I do want to fire it on a blog post. So how would I do that? So I would add page URL does not end with this, right? Because that's this page, right? But it contains a blog, meaning it would fire on any page that does contain the blog, but does not end with this URL. This one doesn't because it also has a title at the end. So it ends with banking. That's basically how it ends. That's the last, say, section of this URL. So that fits our conditions. We could potentially add even more conditions. So apart from, let's say, built-in variables, we could use custom variables. So the ones that we added ourselves. And there's one particular example that I have here. Bear in mind, you might not see this example on your end, in your account, unless you create it, obviously. But basically, this variable that we've created captures the values of category of a blog post. Like in this case, that's finances. And let's say we would want to fire it a particular tag only on finances blog post category. So not only on a blog post, but on a specific blog post of a category finances. So it would fire on this blog post, but not on this blog post, insurances, because it's a different category. So that's how we could play with event conditions. Those are probably some advanced, say, conditions. In most cases, you would use 1 or 2 lines of page URL for PageView triggers. That's my sort of experience with a trigger, but you can use all different kinds of conditioning. Now let's test our tag. So I'm going to leave it as it is, and I'm going to save it. Now in here, I have empty tag to which I'm going to attach my trigger. Now, this tag does nothing, meaning it's an empty script. So it doesn't send any information, doesn't do anything on a website, but it is good enough for us to test our triggers today. So I'm going to use this tag throughout this video. So I'm going to show it you once and later I'm just going to use it for any other example. I already saved my trigger, so I don't need to add it. I just need to find it on my list. So page view trigger. Okay, I'm going to save it. And now let's go into debug mode. I'm going to close it because I need to refresh debug mode. And let's find our tag so we can see empty tag. We're going to go to this page. We can see that it didn't fire on this page, so that's good. That's the condition we want to fire it on a blog, but not on this particular page. Let's check the finance page. And let's see. Yeah, it was fired, so it got fired one time. But now let's go back to this page and check the different insurances page, which it should have fired on. It didn't fire on this page, so I guess our tag is working properly. We could go and see that tag and see the exact triggers that we assign here. So page view trigger, blog category finances, contains blog, but does not end with this particular URL as we see here. So our trigger is working properly. Another trigger type is audience detection CDP trigger. Now, I'm not going to discuss this trigger in this video because I would have to provide the concept of CDP. I'm going to discuss it in another video when I'm going to be talking about CDP. I'm going to skip straight to the click trigger type. So I'm going to click on click trigger type and I'm going to hit next. So let's give our tag a name, so click trigger. And here we have option wait for tags before loading the next page. Now, if turned on, tags using this trigger will have some extra time to fire before links are open and no delay is recommended. So this option will not be used for most of the cases. However, a delay is recommended only if some events need to happen before the redirect, or perhaps some other use cases that you might think of. But delay loading next page is being set by default for 500 milliseconds. It can be changed and can be increased if that's what you need. How do we recognize a trigger that does have it and doesn't? Now, if we go to our page and if we go to our event log, if I click here, notice that we have capturing click and click. STG click is the one that has this option on. So this is when we would fire a tag on this particular event. If we have it turned off, it would fire on the, let's click again, we would fire it on capturing click rather than STG click. So that's how we can differentiate those. Again, in most cases, you won't need to use that. And then we have event conditions. In here, we have two options: on all clicks, which means that the tag would fire on any sort of clicks, even on an empty space. So all clicks on our website, which could be useful for some sort of click maps or heat maps tags. In most cases, though, we would use some sort of conditions. And because it's a click trigger, we have click specific variables to be used for our click trigger. So click ID, which basically means that a tag would fire when a visitor clicks on a specified ID conditions. Click URL means that the tag would fire when the visitor clicks on a link with the selected URL conditions. And it's the same for a class. We use element class. And then click element. If we were to use this one, it allows to use either CSS selector or XPath. CSS selector especially could be very powerful. Sometimes it might be hard to arrive at the specific condition for using only click class or ID, even when we use multiple conditions. But CSS selectors could be sort of very useful in those cases if you know how to use them. Obviously, we could add multiple conditions. So we could say provide class ABC and the URL that contains X, Y, Z. So that would mean that if the URL and the class conditions are met, then tag would fire, which would be useful for when class is used throughout the different elements on different URLs, but we want to fire a tag on specific URLs or URL, then we could use two conditions. Now, what would happen if we were to use just a page URL condition for a click trigger? Well, it would mean that all clicks on specified URL conditions would fire a tag. And now let's get to the example. So let's show an example of a click trigger. So what we need to do, we need to go back to our website, and let's open a website in a debug mode. And let's say I want to fire a tag when somebody clicks on this button. So I could go to event log and click on button, and we can see that we got recorded capturing click and a STG click. So let's click on that one. Let's see what is available upon that click. So we don't have a click ID. We do have a click class. So that's one way of grabbing a class. We can copy it from here. But alternative way, we could also use DevTools. So I can inspect the element with DevTools. That's how you do it in the Chrome browser, but different browsers have different ways of accessing the DevTools. That's how we do it in the Chrome browser. In here, I have this button selected, so I can copy it from here as well. So we can do both ways. We can see that it's a class. So I'm going to go back to my trigger. I'm going to change it to class. I'm going to change the condition to equals. And I'm going to paste it. Remember to paste it as it is with all the spaces at the end and anywhere in the middle, because notice that in here we have a class and then we have a space right after. If I were to use contains, it wouldn't be a big deal if I missed that very last bit of the class, the space. But because I'm using equals, we need to paste it exactly as it is on the website. So let's click on add, and then let's go back to our empty tag and let's choose our trigger. There it is. Let's save it. And now let's close these pages and open a debug mode yet again to refresh the list in our debug mode. Let's find our tag, empty tag. There it is. And upon that click, that tag should fire. So you can see it fired. We can test it again. Okay, it works. If I were to click on that, I can see my empty script tag and I can see the conditions, and it got fired 2 times. So we can see that our click trigger is working. Next trigger is a data layer event trigger. I've switched to e-commerce website for this one to show you how it works. But before we begin explaining the trigger, it is probably good to explain briefly what is a data layer. So in a layman words, data layer is a temporary storage area for storing data. Interactions in event, interactions that are taking place on our website could be sent to data layer. In fact, all events that we see here are actually being recorded in the data layer. This is where the debugger takes that information from. So if I were to inspect our website in a console and enter data layer and click on it, we can see that the 94 events that are here, if I were to hit enter, they're all being recorded here. Leave content, timer, what else? Scroll. All this information is being recorded in the data layer, and this is where event log is taking it from. Now, on top of that, we could be sending our own events. So on top of all these events that are being logged here, we could send our own events through our backend or via our e-commerce system that we're using on our website. So whenever somebody clicks on an add to cart button, let's do that, we will see the recording, not only the click, but add to cart event. And this is how we could potentially trigger a tag. Why would we want to do that? We would do that to ensure that our data in the data layer is consistent and organized and is less prone for any changes on our website. While certain button may change its class or its ID, the data layer event could stay the same because it is being done via backend. But let's see how we could add a data layer trigger. So let's click on add a data layer event trigger. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to hit next, data layer event, and in here you need to provide the name of the data layer event. So if I were to add to cart event, we can see add to cart. So I need to use it. Add to cart. Let's call it add to cart data layer event trigger, and add it in here. Now we need to go to tag, empty tag, and choose an existing tag. So that's the one we've just created. Let's save it. And let's close the page and open it in a debug mode. Now that's view product. We want to go to add to cart. That's our empty tag. So upon a click, the empty tag should fire. And it got fired. And we can see that it got fired one time. And we can see data layer event add to cart. So that's how add to cart works. Now, again, bear in mind, we would need to have in place those data layer events. So they would need to be sent through our backend or via this e-commerce systems. Quite often they handle send of these data add to cart and product view, order, all different e-commerce events. Next, there's a form submission trigger. So let's take a look. In many respects, it's very similar to a click trigger, but there are differences. So let's take a look. First, let's give it a name. And then in here, we have two options: on all form submissions, which means that any form submission on our website would fire the tag with this trigger. But in many cases, we would want to add some conditions. So we have form submission trigger specific variables to specify conditions: form ID variable, form URL, form class, form name. So we can use these. Form ID, obviously, if the form has an ID, we can specify the ID. URL, the URL on which the form exists. Form class, which is the class of the form. Form name. So if the form has a name, then we can use as a trigger as well. But let's take a look at our website. So I'm going to open debugger again. And in here, I have a contact us form. So notice that in the event log, when I'm clicking on a send button, meaning I'm not sending the form, we do record click triggers, right? We have a STG click and STG capturing click, but we don't see a form submission trigger. So I would need to fill it in. So let me do that. And now when clicking on a send, notice that there's going to be form submission event. There you go. It went right here. And I could click on that and check some variables. So if I scroll down, I'll be able to see some form specific variables. Form URL, form class, which this one doesn't have, form ID. So we can find it here. Or just like with a click trigger, we could potentially use inspect element and then find the form, in this case, ID. So let's do that. I'm going to copy the form ID from here. But again, you could use debugger or DevTools of the browser. So let's use a form ID equals, and then let's add it. And then let's find our empty tag. Let's attach the trigger, form submission trigger, the one that we've just added. Save it. And now let's close it and refresh the page with the debugger. I'm going to go to contact us form. I'm going to fill it in again. Let's find a tag. That's the empty tag. And we can see that it got fired. So it got fired on this form. But if I were to use this one, let's see if it's going to get fired. Empty tag wasn't fired. It was fired only once. Different form was fired, but not this one. So we can see that our form tag is working. Next, there's a timer trigger. So the way it works is by sending timer events in the following intervals: 3, 5, 15, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. The important part is that the timer resets whenever the page reloads, and it is being fired only once per session. So let's have a look how it works. So let's first give it a name. So timer trigger, let's set it for 5 seconds so we won't have to wait for long. Let's add a trigger and then let's attach it to our empty tag we've been using throughout this video. So timer trigger, let's save it. And now let's open our debug mode. And now notice in the event log, we've got timer, so that's fine. And our tag should be fired by now, empty tag, because 5 seconds already had passed. If we take a look at it, we'll be able to see 5 seconds and that it fires once per session. So that's the timer trigger. Next, there's a page leaf trigger. And first, let's give it a name. And basically what it does, it fires a tag whenever the mouse cursor is leaving the website area. So if I were to do that, it would fire a tag. But let's have a proper look in a debug mode, what events it logs. So if we were to go to event log, and as soon as I'm going to move my mouse through the top or through the sides, it logs the leave content event, which means that the cursor is leaving the website area. It can fire for only top leave content or through the sides, right hand side, or a bottom if you want to. What do I mean by that? If I were to go to the settings, I can fire a tag only for the upper boundary, exit intent, or I can switch it to upper, bottom, or side page boundary, exit intent. Now I'm going to add one with the upper page boundary intent, but before we add it, what would be the use case? We could potentially fire a custom content or custom pop-up tag, which would show me a pop-up on the screen with the, let's say, a form that asks for leaving an email or some sort of contact number. So before the visitor leaves and clicks on the X button, we can get the email or some sort of contact details from the visitor to get back to them, and so they can stay on the loop, so you can still get in touch with them before they leave the website. But let's add our trigger. So I'm going to click add, and now let's attach it to our tag. And so I'm going to choose page leaf trigger. I'm going to save it. Let's close these pages and let's open a debug mode yet again. So our tag is here. So let's move the cursor to the top, fire it once, fire it 2 times, 3 times. So we can see that it is working, and we can take a look. That's our empty tag, and those are our conditions for our tag. So that's a page leaf trigger. Another trigger type is page scroll, which basically fire a tag on a specific scroll depth. And we can talk about scroll depth in percentages or pixels. Now, what do I mean by scroll depth? So when I'm on a website, I can scroll page, and we can see that the scroll events are being recorded. And if I scroll to the very bottom, that's a 100% scroll. If I scroll halfway through, that's 50% scroll, and so on. And we could fire a tag, let's say on some sort of blog post that is a very long content, or a landing page, and some important information, or CTA, call to action button, is halfway through the page or 75% through the page. And we want to fire a tag on some sort of custom event or goal, whatever, meaning that it's an engaged session or a visitor seeing the element. And based on that, we can get some conclusions about the engagement on a website or behavior on a website. That's the use case. Now let's set up our trigger. So I'm going to set mine for using percentages, and I'm going to set for 75%, and then I'm going to give it a name, 75% scroll trigger. You could potentially fire it on specific URL or URLs using conditions, but I'm going to fire it on all page scrolls. So on every page, we could potentially fire that tag as long as the visitor scroll 75% on that page. So let's add it and let's attach it to our empty tag. So that's our trigger. Let's hit OK and save it. And now let's close the page and let's open a debug mode again. And let's find our tag before we start scrolling. That's our empty tag. And we can see that at about 75%, the tag got fired. Let's try it again. Yep, it got fired again. And let's do it slowly so we can see that it's not necessarily 100%. Yeah, so it's not entire page, but 75%, and then it got fired. So we can see that it is working, and that's the page scroll trigger. Next trigger is history change SPA trigger. SPA is an acronym for single page application website. So basically, this trigger is mainly used for single page application websites. In fact, the website that we've been using throughout this video is a single page application website, meaning basically we use history change trigger to track single page application because single page applications dynamically update content without fully page reloads. So the entire page was not reloaded, only the content that is relevant to the change. Like the top of the website, the header has not been reloaded. It stays the same. In this trigger, the text changes in the browser's history state. So in the history of the browser rather than taking it from server. And that happens when we reload the page. When we click a refresh page, the entire page refreshes. We can see that the entire page refreshed. Whereas when we're going from one URL to another, that does not happen for a single page application, which is the website that we're currently looking at. And if we refresh the page, notice that we have page load, page view. So we have a regular page view, but in case of going from one URL to another on a single page application, we record the click, that's one thing, but we also record the debounce histories. So this is what we mean by the history state. Basically, it signals the content update and it ensures accurate tracking of user interactions and navigation within the single page application website. So that's the background of this very trigger. But how do we use it? First, let's give it a name. So history change trigger. In here, we have wait 1 second before firing the tag. This is a recommended for whenever we track manually single page applications, because Piwik Pro provides a way of tracking automatically single page applications, what types of website in the administration tab. So if you were to go to administration tab, there's a setting where you can automatically start tracking single page application websites without any manual setup. However, you could in some cases do it manually. Let's just add a tag so we can see how it's working basically. Here you can fire it on all history change events or when all these conditions are met. So you could, for those edge cases, you could provide some conditions. But let's add a trigger and now let's pair it with our empty tag. So I'm going to add it and I'm going to save it. And now let's close the page. Now let's go to the empty tag. And once I get to the loans or block, that tag should fire. So it got fired. It had 1 second delay. You can see it was fired. Now let's have a look what happens when we don't delay the tag, the trigger. Now we use it to properly capture the page titles, because with the single page applications, when we click quickly between different URLs, before the page loads, the page titles may not be correctly captured. But let's have a look how it fires when we don't have that delay. Let's refresh our debug mode. That's the empty tag. Let's have a look. See? It fires immediately. So that's the history change tag trigger. Next trigger is a element presence trigger, which basically fires a tag whenever we specify a CSS selector for an element. And then when that element is present on the page, it will fire a tag, which could be used to measure the visibility of ad banners to ensure they are being seen by the user, that the element was visible on the screen, meaning it was loaded on the screen, which sometimes they might be dynamically loaded. So that would be a use case. In our case, we're just going to use a simple blog post category element. So just to show you how it works. So we're going to check for whether this element is present on the screen. But first, let's give our trigger a name. So element presence trigger. And first, we need to come up with a good CSS selector. And for that reason, I'm going to inspect that element. So that's the blog post category class. I'm going to use it in the form of a CSS selector. So in order to point to the class, we need to enter dot and then post category. And that will be our trigger condition. We could potentially add more conditions, but I'll leave it as it is. And now let's attach it to our tag. And then in here, let's choose our element presence trigger and let's save it. Now let's close these pages. Now let's open a debug mode. You can see that the tag didn't fire here. It didn't fire here, obviously, because we don't have a blog post category. It didn't fire here because we don't have blog post category. And then it fires here because we do have it here. Let's check for other blog posts. Let's say this one. It got fired again. And it got fired again because we have money tips blog post category. So that's the element presence trigger. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to our channel. Check the description below to find some useful links like free Piwik Pro sign up page, community forum page, and links to related videos. Until next time.